In the summer of 1940, as German troops paraded triumphantly through Paris, a mood of invincibility swept across the Third Reich. The lightning campaigns in Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France had fallen like dominoes in a matter of months. Blitzkrieg appeared unstoppable. In Berlin's officer clubs and in occupied capitals, German generals and staff officers spoke with supreme confidence. When the conversation turned to the United States, laughter often followed. To them, America was not a military power but a curiosity. A nation of mechanics, some sneered, where factories produced cars and refrigerators, but not serious weapons of war. German officers derided the U.S. Army as a hollow force, still ranked only 17th in the world in 1939, smaller than that of Portugal. They pointed to America's isolationist Congress, to its lack of modern tanks, and to its supposed unwillingness to shed blood overseas. If they come, one officer wrote mockingly in his diary, they will drive tractors, not tanks. In the Reich Chancellery, Hitler himself dismissed American industrial potential as unfocused and clumsy. In a speech before his generals, he scoffed at the idea that an undisciplined democracy could rival Germany's disciplined war machine. He believed American workers, untrained in hardship, would collapse under the strains of total war. In Berlin cafes and propaganda pamphlets, America was portrayed as a land of jazz, movies, and soft comforts, hardly a match for the steel and iron resolve of the Wehrmacht. The irony of such arrogance was sharp. Across the Atlantic, America's factories were indeed humming with cars and consumer goods. But the assembly lines that built automobiles could just as easily turn to tanks, and the skilled hands that riveted aircraft for civilian travel could just as quickly shift to building fighters and bombers. By mocking the United States as incapable, Germany underestimated the very thing that would one day overwhelm them: the ability of a free society to mobilize its vast industrial base with breathtaking speed. For German officers in 1940, that truth was unimaginable. At the time, their eyes focused eastward, toward the Soviet Union, or southward, toward Britain. The United States was distant, disorganized, and politically divided. They saw no evidence of an immediate threat. Propaganda only deepened the misconception. German newsreels and radio broadcasts painted Americans as naive, their soldiers ill-prepared, their commanders inexperienced. They build machines, not warriors, declared one broadcast, ridiculing the idea of American fighting spirit. But in the halls of Washington and Detroit, men were already planning. Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech in December 1940 declared that the United States would not remain idle while fascism consumed the world. Shipyards expanded, auto plants prepared for conversion, and designs for new tanks and planes were pushed into production. While German generals laughed, American assembly lines were preparing to roar to life. One German officer, years later, reflected with bitter honesty on those early days. We thought them unserious. We thought their machines were toys. Only later did we realize the machines would not stop coming. The laughter of 1940 and 1941 carried an edge of contempt, but it was built on a fatal miscalculation. What the Germans dismissed as softness was, in reality, a reservoir of untapped strength. And when that strength was awakened, it would not be measured in tractors, but in 50,000 tanks rolling across the battlefields of Europe. The stage was set. German arrogance would soon meet American industry head-on. And in that clash, the sneers of 1940 would echo as bitter reminders of a war they had underestimated. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 shattered America's isolation and propelled the nation into total war. Within hours of Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech, Congress declared war, and the United States set in motion the greatest industrial mobilization in history. The president's earlier promise to transform the nation into the arsenal of democracy was no longer rhetoric. It became the blueprint for survival. Factories that once produced cars, refrigerators, and farm equipment were rapidly converted into war plants. In Detroit, Henry Ford's Willow Run plant became the largest factory under a single roof on Earth. It stretched nearly a mile long, with assembly lines capable of turning out one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour by 1944. The scale defied imagination. Riveters, machinists, and inspectors worked around the clock, their shifts blurring into one another beneath the floodlights. Women in bandanas, immortalized as Rosie the Riveter, stepped into roles once reserved for men, proving that the home front was as vital as any battlefield. Chrysler, once synonymous with cars, now operated the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. Its vast halls roared with the clanging of steel and the hiss of welding torches as Sherman tanks rolled off the lines in endless succession. General Motors produced aircraft engines, Packard built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license, and even typewriter companies shifted to making rifles and machine guns. By 1945, the United States had produced more than 88,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, and millions of trucks, rifles, and artillery pieces. The transformation was not just industrial, but cultural. On the streets of America's cities, posters urged civilians to do the job he left behind. Scrap drives collected rubber, tin, and aluminum. Ration books regulated gasoline, meat, and sugar so that the front lines never went hungry. From steel mills in Pittsburgh to shipyards in San Francisco, the hum of machinery and the glow of furnaces testified to a nation that had turned itself into a war machine. German intelligence officers, watching from afar, initially dismissed the reports. To them, figures of tens of thousands of tanks or planes rolling off American lines seemed absurd. Exaggerated propaganda meant to bolster morale. The Reich believed its disciplined industry and battle-tested armies could outlast what they saw as America's inexperience and softness. Yet the truth was that America's vast geography, abundant resources, and decentralized industry gave it a depth of strength Germany could not match. One German officer later admitted in post-war reflection that, "We thought America could not organize such chaos into power. When we learned their true numbers, we realized the war was lost long before we admitted it." By 1943, convoys of Liberty and Victory ships carried tanks, planes, and ammunition across the Atlantic to Britain and Africa. These supply lines, built faster than U-boats could sink them, fed the Allied offensives in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. On the other side of the world, fleets of aircraft launched from Pacific Islands bore the stamp of Detroit, Buffalo, and Seattle. The sheer momentum of American industry was staggering. While Germany fought to replace each Panzer or Messerschmitt lost in combat, the United States replaced its losses overnight and added thousands more besides. The arsenal of democracy was not just a slogan, it was the decisive engine of Allied power. For German officers who once laughed at the idea of American tanks, the reality was sobering. What had begun as derision in 1940 now turned into uneasy whispers by 1942 and outright fear by 1943. The factories they mocked were producing the steel tide that would one day roll across Europe. The laughter had ended. In its place came the realization that America's industrial awakening was not a dream, but a storm. And soon, that storm would break upon the battlefields of Africa, Italy, and France. From the humming factories of Detroit to the mud-soaked fields of Normandy, one machine came to symbolize America's industrial might: the M4 Sherman tank. Unlike the formidable German Panthers and Tigers that stalked the eastern and western fronts, the Sherman was not designed as an invincible predator. Instead, it was engineered to be a dependable workhorse, reliable, easy to repair, and capable of rolling off assembly lines in numbers that no enemy could hope to match. The design philosophy behind the Sherman reflected America's approach to the war itself: mass production, standardization, and speed. Introduced in 1942, the M4 was armed with a 75mm main gun, later upgraded to a more potent 76mm, and powered by engines adapted from the automobile industry. Its armor, though sufficient against lighter German vehicles, was vulnerable to the high-velocity 75mm and 88mm guns mounted on Panzers and Tigers. Yet the Sherman's genius lay not in superiority of firepower, but in reliability. A Sherman could be repaired in the field with spare parts readily available, while German tanks often broke down and required extensive maintenance far from the front. On the battlefield, this difference became critical. American crews often spoke of their Shermans as forgiving machines. One veteran later reflected that, while German tanks were terrifying, we always had another Sherman ready to fight. even if one was knocked out. This resilience was bolstered by America's ability to replace losses almost overnight. Where Germany struggled to produce a few hundred heavy tanks in a month, U.S. factories churned out thousands of Shermans, supported by a supply system that kept them fueled, armed, and moving forward. German reports captured the psychological weight of this imbalance. A Panzer officer noted in 1944 that for every tank we destroy, 3 more take its place. It is like fighting the ocean. Against this tide, even the superior armor and firepower of the Tiger became less decisive. German tank aces could score multiple kills in a single engagement, but they could not halt the steady advance of Allied armored divisions, replenished daily with fresh machines. The Sherman also excelled in adaptability. Variants mounted flamethrowers for clearing bunkers, bridge-laying equipment for river crossings, and even amphibious modifications for the D-Day landings. In Italy and France, Shermans clambered over rubble-strewn towns and hedgerows, their engines roaring as infantry clung to their hulls. In the Pacific, they proved invaluable in island assaults, where their mechanical reliability and supporting firepower turned the tide against entrenched Japanese defenders. Descriptions of the battlefield reveal the sensory reality of the Sherman's dominance. Columns of olive-drab tanks rumbled across the countryside, their treads grinding over cobblestones and dirt roads. The sharp crack of their guns echoed through forests and villages, while the acrid smell of cordite and burning oil lingered in the air. Contrails scarred the sky above as Allied aircraft circled overhead, completing the image of overwhelming combined arms power. At the same time, the Sherman's limitations could not be ignored. American crews lived with the sobering knowledge that their tanks were outgunned and out-armored by German heavyweights. Many called the Sherman a death trap when faced with Tigers or Panthers in open combat. Yet this grim reality only reinforced the importance of numbers, coordination, and logistics. Where a single Tiger might hold off a handful of Shermans, it could not withstand an entire armored regiment, supported by artillery and airstrikes. Behind the front lines, the American supply system was a marvel of organization. Trains, ships, and endless convoys of trucks ensured that fuel, ammunition, and spare parts reached the front. Shermans could be refueled and rearmed within hours, sent back into action, while German tanks languished for days awaiting scarce supplies. This logistical machine, quiet, relentless, and unseen, was as decisive as any battle won with guns and steel. As the Allies advanced into France in 1944 and pressed toward Germany in 1945, the Sherman became a constant presence, both feared and ridiculed by enemy forces. It was not elegant, nor was it invincible, but it embodied the raw industrial force that Germany had once mocked. Each Sherman rolling across a European field was a reminder that the United States had harnessed its factories, its workers, and its ingenuity to wage war on a scale the world had never witnessed. The Sherman was more than just a tank. It was a symbol of America's philosophy of war, overwhelming production, relentless supply, and the will to keep moving forward. And as these steel behemoths pushed into the heart of Germany, they carried with them not only shells and armor, but the weight of a nation determined to prove that its factories could defeat an empire. The first true clash between America's armored forces and Germany's veteran panzers came under the scorching North African sun. In February 1943, at Kasserine Pass, the U.S. Army was blooded. Columns of M3 Lee and early Shermans struggled against disciplined German formations led by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. German Panzer IVs and assault guns exploited every weakness, cutting through inexperienced American crews who were unaccustomed to coordinated tank warfare. Dust choked the air as machine gun fire rattled off steel hulls, and American units fell back in disarray. One German officer later recorded in his diary that the Americans fought bravely, but their inexperience was plain. They did not yet understand war. Yet the defeat at Kasserine was not the end. It was the beginning of an accelerated education. American commanders studied their mistakes, improving coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery. New supply systems ensured fuel and ammunition flowed uninterrupted. Within months, at battles like El Getter, U.S. forces rebounded, Shermans grinding forward in disciplined formations, proving that America could learn faster than Germany anticipated. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, that hard-earned experience met the full weight of American industry. The beaches were littered with steel and smoke as waves of men and machines pushed inland. Among them, thousands of Sherman tanks rolled ashore, their engines rumbling through the surf and hedgerows. While German Panther and Tiger tanks lurked in the bocage, waiting to ambush, the Allies had a weapon the Wehrmacht could not match: scale. Cinematic imagery defined the battlefields of Normandy. In narrow lanes lined with tall hedges, Shermans crept forward, their guns elevated, infantry following in their shadow. German anti-tank weapons struck with lethal precision, turning several tanks into burning wrecks in moments. But where one Sherman fell, two more advanced to fill the gap. American crews endured fear and loss, but they could trust that reinforcements would arrive within days, if not hours. A German officer, stunned by the pace of replenishment, remarked that their losses mean nothing. They return tomorrow with fresh tanks and crews. This relentless renewal eroded the tactical superiority of German armor. A Tiger tank might destroy several Shermans in a single engagement, but it could not stop the tide. Tigers were rare, often immobilized by mechanical failures or stranded without fuel, while the Shermans kept coming. Allied engineers even adapted their tanks for the unique challenges of Normandy, fitting some with bulldozer blades to clear obstacles or rhino devices to tear through hedgerows, denying the Germans their natural defenses. The clash in Normandy was not only one of steel, but of supply chains. Behind every advancing Sherman stood an invisible army of workers and logisticians. Ships ferried replacement tanks across the Atlantic, while convoys of trucks delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to the front. This logistical machine gave the U.S. Army a resilience the Germans could scarcely comprehend. Losses that would have crippled another nation were absorbed and replaced almost overnight. For American tank crews, the experience was both harrowing and sobering. They faced enemies with superior guns and thicker armor, yet they pressed forward, knowing their strength lay in numbers and persistence. One veteran recalled, "We knew the Germans could kill us faster than we could kill them, but we also knew we would always come back with more." That grim calculus defined the campaign, transforming the Sherman from a vulnerable machine into a symbol of inexhaustible pressure. By the end of the Normandy campaign, German commanders no longer laughed at American factories. They saw firsthand how assembly lines thousands of miles away dictated the pace of battle in Europe. Where once they dismissed America as a nation of mechanics, they now faced an opponent whose mechanics had turned industry into a weapon more devastating than any single tank. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy, the United States proved that industrial might, paired with adaptation and resilience, could overcome even the most seasoned enemy. And as Sherman after Sherman rolled eastward toward the heart of Germany, it became clear that this was not just a battle of machines, but a battle of systems, a contest the Allies were destined to win. By 1944, the tone inside German headquarters had shifted from scorn to disbelief. The jokes about tractors instead of tanks had long since vanished. What replaced them were weary notes in war diaries and terse reports to Berlin, filled with anxiety over the sheer weight of American industry crashing down upon the Reich. Officers who once mocked America's soft soldiers and amateur generals now confessed that their greatest enemy was not a single battlefield defeat, but the endless tide of reinforcements. On both the eastern and western fronts, the pattern was unmistakable. German commanders observed with frustration that each time they knocked out a column of Shermans or inflicted losses on an American division, replacements poured in almost immediately. One officer recorded bitterly in his journal, "For every Tiger we destroy, 3 more Shermans appear the next day. How can one fight such a flood?" The arithmetic of war had turned against Germany, and the math was unforgiving. In Normandy, German units struggled to hold back the Allied advance through the bocage. Panzers ambushed convoys, anti-tank guns shattered American armor, yet the attacks felt like trying to hold back the sea with bare hands. Convoys of fresh tanks, trucks, and fuel rolled forward day after day. A German sergeant noted after one engagement, "They lose men, they lose tanks, and yet the next morning they are there again, stronger than before. What had once been confidence in German superiority turned to exhaustion and creeping despair. The shock was not only on the ground. Overhead, vast bomber streams scarred the skies. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators thundered toward their targets, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustangs. German flak batteries fired until their barrels glowed red, yet still the formations came. For the men in the trenches and the officers in their command posts, the sight of thousands of aircraft blotting out the sun was a grim reminder. America's factories were producing faster than Germany could destroy. The psychological impact of this industrial avalanche weighed heavily on the Wehrmacht. By late 1944, morale reports sent to Berlin spoke of a growing sense of futility. Soldiers whispered that while they fought heroically, they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outproduced. One officer, reflecting after the war, admitted, "We realized then that Germany could not win." The enemy's strength lay not only in his weapons, but in his endless capacity to replace them. The Eastern Front provided further confirmation. German units retreating from Soviet offensives often found themselves facing not just Red Army armor, but American-made Lend-Lease trucks and supplies that kept the Soviet advance moving. German soldiers marveled bitterly that even their eastern enemy was being sustained by the arsenal of democracy. The irony was not lost. The nation once ridiculed as a land of amateurs had become the lifeline of the very army grinding Germany down. Descriptions of American convoys entering battle reveal the scale that unnerved German observers. Endless lines of tanks, half-tracks, and trucks stretched across the horizon. Fuel and ammunition seemed inexhaustible. Compared to Germany's shortages, where armored divisions sometimes received only a handful of replacements for dozens of losses, the imbalance was staggering. Even veteran panzer commanders, skilled in ambush and maneuver, began to admit privately that their tactical victories meant little in the face of America's overwhelming numbers. By the winter of 1944, the laughter of 1940 was a distant memory. The officers who once mocked America's factories now watched helplessly as those same factories dictated the tempo of war. German intelligence reports, once dismissive of American capabilities, now warned that the Allies' industrial strength was beyond calculation. The arrogance of the early war years had been replaced by resignation, and in many cases, fear. The realization spread like a shadow through the ranks. This was not just a war of tanks and guns, but a war of production lines and supply ships. Germany had underestimated its enemy, and now it was paying the price. The stage was set for the final battles of the Reich, where America's unrelenting tide of armor, aircraft, and manpower would roll across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany itself. The thunder of American armor across Europe in 1944 and 1945 was more than battlefield strategy. It was the living proof of industrial war unleashed. What had begun as Roosevelt's promise to make the United States the arsenal of democracy was now felt on the front lines, where German soldiers saw firsthand the tidal wave of men and machines flowing relentlessly west to east. After the Normandy breakout in July 1944, the Allies surged across France with a speed that stunned even their own commanders. While German units scrambled to regroup after the collapse at Falaise, American convoys poured through newly repaired roads and bridges. Engineers worked night and day, throwing up Bailey bridges across rivers that the Wehrmacht had believed impassable. Tanks that bogged down were pulled free and repaired, often re-entering combat within hours. German commanders noted bitterly that every loss inflicted seemed meaningless in the face of America's ability to recover. Nowhere was this imbalance more stark than in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last great gamble relied on surprise, bad weather, and the hope that Allied logistics would crack under sudden pressure. For a time, it seemed to work. American units were driven back, towns like Bastogne were encircled, and German armor pushed deep into the Ardennes. Yet the U.S. response revealed the true power of its war machine. Within days, entire divisions were shifted hundreds of miles, carried on convoys of trucks fueled by seemingly endless supplies. Replacement tanks rolled forward to blunt the spearheads of the panzers. By the time skies cleared and Allied aircraft roared overhead once more, the German offensive was already doomed. One German officer later reflected that the Ardennes was the moment the Wehrmacht realized the futility of its efforts. Our men fought bravely, but every day fresh enemy divisions arrived. Their supplies were inexhaustible. Ours were gone. The contrast could not have been sharper. Germany's panzer units rationed fuel, while American tankers topped off their Shermans without hesitation, often leaving engines idling in the cold as they waited for the order to advance. The logistical feats were as critical as the fighting itself. When bridges were destroyed by retreating Germans, American engineers rebuilt them in record time. During the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, pontoon bridges stretched across the river within days, allowing entire armored divisions to surge forward. Where German units struggled to move a handful of tanks across makeshift crossings, the Americans were moving thousands of vehicles daily. Aircraft losses told a similar story. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, had been reduced to fragments. In contrast, U.S. factories churned out replacements so quickly that downed squadrons were re-equipped in days. By spring 1945, the Allies enjoyed near-total air supremacy. 4 German troops on the ground, the constant drone of American bombers, and the sharp scream of P-47 Thunderbolts became part of the nightmare of defeat. The effect on German morale was devastating. Diaries captured the despair of soldiers who watched their comrades fight bravely only to be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. "It is like a flood," one soldier wrote in January 1945. "We dig in, we resist, but they keep coming. Every road brings more tanks, more trucks, more planes. There is no end." The myth of German invincibility had evaporated under the relentless weight of American industry. By April 1945, as Allied forces rolled into the heart of the Reich, the truth was undeniable. German cities lay in ruins from Allied bombers. Their armies were shattered on the eastern and western fronts, and their officers admitted privately that defeat was inevitable. The Reich had not only been outmaneuvered and outfought, it had been outbuilt. What began as German laughter in 1940 ended in stunned silence 5 years later. The tidal wave of American production had proven unstoppable, and its force carried Allied armies across the Rhine and into Berlin's shadow. The industrial juggernaut that Germany once dismissed as a land of mechanics had sealed the fate of the Third Reich. By 1945, the Third Reich lay in ashes. Cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Cologne were reduced to rubble, their once proud boulevards transformed into smoking ruins. Factories stood silent, railways twisted and broken. Yet across the Atlantic, American plants still thundered with life. Even as Allied armies marched into Germany, U.S. factories continued to roll tanks, trucks, and aircraft off the assembly lines, an industrial machine that seemed to know no limits. The irony was stark. In 1940, German officers had sneered at the United States as a nation of mechanics, incapable of waging a modern war. They had laughed at the idea that Americans, more accustomed to automobiles and tractors, could ever produce weapons capable of challenging the Reich. Yet by war's end, those very mechanics had proven decisive. Their factories had built the arsenal that drowned Nazi Germany under a tidal wave of material. The Sherman tank, mocked for its modest armor and firepower, had become a symbol of persistence. For every German Tiger destroyed in battle, another dozen Shermans appeared on the field, each supported by endless convoys of trucks, fuel, and spare parts. German soldiers soon realized they were not fighting individual tanks, but an industrial system that could regenerate endlessly. One officer admitted bitterly, "For every machine we burn, 3 more come forward." We fight against numbers, not men. It was not just tanks. By 1945, the United States had produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and millions of rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces. The Liberty ships of American shipyards carried supplies across the Atlantic faster than German U-boats could sink them. Entire divisions were equipped and re-equipped with a speed that stunned the Wehrmacht, while German formations dwindled for lack of fuel and ammunition. The war had revealed a fundamental truth. Battles are won not only on the front lines, but in the foundries, factories, and assembly halls far behind them. Workers, men and women, who riveted steel, forged engines and rolled armor plate became as essential to victory as the soldiers who fought with those weapons. In Detroit, at Willow Run, at the Arsenal tank plant, and in hundreds of other sites, America's industrial might became its greatest weapon. For Germany, the psychological blow was as heavy as the material one. The Reich had bet on speed, skill, and tactical superiority, but skill could not overcome scale. Precision engineering could not match the raw momentum of an assembly line that never slept. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945 with fleets of tanks, trucks, and aircraft, the Reich understood at last that the war had been decided long before on the factory floor. As peace returned, the lesson lingered. The Sherman, the Hellcat, the B-24 bomber, these machines became symbols not of perfection, but of production. They represented a strategy where reliability, standardization, and sheer volume proved deadlier than any so-called wonder weapon. America had shown that modern war was not just about generals and battlefields, but about welders, machinists, and assembly line workers who outbuilt the enemy. And so the story came full circle. What began with German laughter in 1940 ended with silence in 1945. The Reich's confidence that America could not fight a war had been buried beneath 50,000 tanks, hundreds of thousands of aircraft, and an industrial juggernaut unlike anything the world had ever seen. The legacy was clear. In the Second World War, the assembly line became the true weapon of democracy.